All right, welcome back. Well, to round out our conference, we have one more session today, focusing on fiscal and monetary policies for the longer run. And I'm very pleased to introduce our session chair, Min Wei, who is a senior associate director here in the Division of Monetary Affairs, and is also a co-author and longtime colleague of Thomas. So, thank you, Min.
Thank you, Trevor, and welcome back, everyone, again. So in this session, we'll be looking beyond monetary policy and examine issues related to fiscal and monetary policy for the longer run. We're happy to have Ludwig Straub here to present the paper, A Goldilocks Theory of Fiscal Deficit. The paper takes into account the effect of government debt supply on interest rates, a topic that Thomas also worked on. Ludwig is currently assistant professor of economics at Harvard University. His research areas are macroeconomics and international economies. Among his topics of interest are the relationship between rising economic inequality and macroeconomic trends, as well as study of fiscal and monetary policy in heterogeneous agent models. The discussant will be Fiorella De Fiori. Fiorella is currently the head of monetary policy and a research fellow of the Center for Economic Policy Research at the Bank for International Settlements. She previously held the position of advisor in the Monetary Policy Research Division and in the Financial Research Division of the European Central Bank. Her main research is in the field of monetary and financial economies, and it focuses on macro-financial linkages and their implications for monetary policy. Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for the kind words, Min, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this conference honoring Thomas Laubach. I should say at the beginning that when we look at the success of papers like Laubach and Williams, oftentimes we just check on Google Scholar how many citations the paper is getting. But behind many of these citations, there's actually research careers and lives that have been affected. And one such career is actually my own. When I was a grad student at MIT thinking about thesis topics, and I stumbled across their paper about the decline in the natural rate. And so I started thinking, what could be going on here? And among the reasons that hadn't been explored was the fact that income inequality had increased quite dramatically in the US and in other advanced economies. And that actually ultimately became the start of several papers that I've authored on this issue. So in that sense, this is also very much due to the fantastic work that Thomas Laubach and co-authors have done. So the paper I'm going to present today, if I can click to it, perfect, is thinking about how these declines in natural interest rates that we have seen have changed the conduct of fiscal policy and have changed how much fiscal space countries have, and that's how we arrived at this paper. This is joint work with Atif Mian in Princeton and Amr Sufi at the University of Chicago Booth. So the question we want to ask in this project is very broadly, what are the joint dynamics of debt and deficits? And more specifically, if I have higher debt levels, does that represent a positive additional fiscal cost relative to having lower debt levels? Now, the standard logic here in the textbooks is very clear, right? If I increase deficits today, that's going to increase the debt level, and that will require deficits to come down below the original level in the future to sort of pay for the additional deficits. Now, what a recent strand of the literature has figured out is that when R is less than G, the interest rate is below the growth rate of the economy, we may actually never have to cut deficits tomorrow to pay for current increased deficits. It's kind of the idea of a free lunch that has been proposed, but there so far is no general condition under which a free lunch is in fact possible. So what we do in this paper is we provide a general framework that allows us to understand the joint dynamics of debt and deficits, and we arrive at four main conclusions. The first conclusion is a general condition for when a free lunch is possible, and in fact we find that that condition is a tighter version of R less than G. It's not R less than G, but it's R less than G minus phi, where phi is the sensitivity of R minus G to the debt level. And that is in fact a constant that none other than Thomas Laubach actually estimated, and I'm going to talk about that when we get to it. The second is that, that we find that actually at a binding zero lower bound, imagine Japan, for example, we actually find that it's possible that low deficits push up debt levels rather than higher deficits. Why? Because we find that low deficits can hurt aggregate demand at the zero lower bound and can hence lead to less inflation at the zero lower bound, maybe even deflation, and that in and of itself has an effect that pushes debt up relative to GDP. Third, we investigated the role of inequality coming from our previous research on the relationship between inequality and R star. And here we find that inequality generally contributes to increased fiscal space. However, when the economy is at the ZLB, because inequality reduces aggregate demand at the ZLB, it can actually reduce fiscal space in that case. And finally, we provide a calibration of our framework to both the Japanese economy and the US economy in 2019, before COVID, when things were still calm. And we find that actually, surprisingly, we find that the US was barely in the free lunch region, so not that much room for running free lunch policies as advocated by some people in the literature. Whereas Japan, with a much greater level of debt to GDP, actually we found that it's squarely in the free lunch region, that there's actually much more room to run a free lunch kind of policy in Japan. So I'll explain why that is when we get there. I'm going to make these points today with a tractable model that will be based on the idea that government bonds pay a convenience yield to investors. There's a bunch of other models that you can use and arrive at very similar conclusions, and we have all of those in the paper. I'm going to skip over the literature, but there's a very exciting literature going on these topics right now. So I'm going to start by introducing our framework, and then I'm going to take the framework and analyze it in the absence of a zero lower bound constraint. And then I'm going to put the zero lower bound back into the model and see how that changes the conclusions that we arrived at. And then last but not least, I'm going to quantify the framework for the US and the Japanese economies. So what's the framework? So it's a deterministic endowment economy with the potential for rationing at the zero lower bound. There's three main actors in this model. There's the government that issues government debt, spends and taxes. There are two kinds of households, spenders and savers, where savers are going to have specific preference for holding government bonds. And you can think of this preference as being for convenience benefits that government bonds provide to them. And the third actor is a monetary authority that is basically just trying to implement the natural allocation. The only place where that's going to be infeasible is going to be at the zero lower bound. I'm going to use the following notation throughout so that nobody gets lost here. Capital R is the net nominal interest rate. Capital G will be the net nominal growth rate. And the net nominal growth rate will consist of real productivity growth gamma, which will be held constant throughout, and a variable rate of inflation. So whenever I talk about the growth rate changing, that will be entirely due to inflation changing, not because of underlying productivity growth. R star here is the natural interest rate that will always close the output gap and will hit the inflation target if followed throughout. Inflation target itself is denoted by pi star, and G star is nominal trend growth, the nominal growth rate that is obtained when inflation is at its target. I'm going to jump straight to the detrended version of the model. In that version of the model, potential output Y star is going to be a constant, which I'll normalize to 1. So all quantities that you see floating around in the model, they're all should be thought of as relative to potential GDP in the economy. And R minus G is simply the detrended interest rate, which basically appears once you detrend the model at every place where you're used to seeing a normal interest rate. Okay? Given that Thomas Laubach was a very serious researcher and liked models, I'm also going to show you exactly how the model works. It's only 2 slides, so bear with me. There's a lot of graphs that illustrate how this model works right after. Okay, so let me give you the details of the model. There's a household problem. that a fraction 1 minus mu of savers solve. They maximize a discounted stream of utilities over, first, consumption, log consumption there, and second, over holdings of government debt. So B here is government debt relative to potential GDP, and V of B, sort of this convenience utility that savers draw from holdings of government debt. And we assume that that V is an increasing and concave function, very much in line with the literature that has tried to estimate the curvature of that V function, for example, Annette's work on this issue and Thomas Laubach's work, as I'm going to mention later on. The budget constraint of these savers is very standard. We have on the left-hand side consumption and saving. On the right-hand side, we have the detrended interest payments that savers obtain, so R minus G times B. We have their share of aggregate income, 1 minus mu times Y, and we have any lump sum taxes they pay to the government, tau T. Spenders here are very simple. They're just going to basically eat everything they get. They get a share mu of aggregate income Y, and that's all. That's going to be all spent immediately. Finally, what is YT? We assume that YT is basically a labor endowment that everybody has in any given instant. They sell that to a representative firm. Representative firm just takes 1 unit of labor, produces 1 unit of output, and so if we're not at the ZLB, basically all of that labor endowment will get sold to a representative firm, and aggregate output will be equal to potential, equal to 1 in our normalization. If we have that the economy is at the ZLB, then there's the potential for rationing because labor demand now falls short of labor supply, and so in that case, aggregate output Y can be potentially below 1. So the gap between 1 and Y is basically then the output gap in this economy. Okay? Perfect. Second slide on the model. What about fiscal policy? So in this framework, fiscal policy will consist of a triple, consist of government spending X, which we'll take to be constant for now, a path of government debt B, and a path of taxes tau that jointly satisfy the standard flow budget constraint of the government, right? On the left-hand side, government spending and interest payments on existing government debt, and on the right-hand side, additional issuance of government debt as well as tax revenue. The key object that we will use to think about government policy is the primary deficit, Z, defined as the difference between government spending and tax revenue. And when we think about varying the primary deficit, under the hood what the model will do is it will change the path of tax revenue tau. Okay? That's going to be a crucial object in our analysis. The central bank here, sorry to say that, it's going to be really boring because it's basically always going to set R equals to the natural interest rate, and in doing so will obtain the natural allocation, unless said natural interest rate is below 0, in which case it will set the nominal rate of 0. So it's going to be stuck at the ZLB in that case. Now, when the economy is at the ZLB, we're going to have a downward nominal wage rigidity that will basically, all it will do is it will tell us that wage and price inflation is going to fall short of the inflation target pi star. By how much is it going to fall short of? It's going to be given by a standard Phillips curve slope parameter, kappa, times the output gap of the economy. So all that is doing is that it's telling us that there's a Phillips curve that becomes active at the ZLB, which will tell us how much inflation will fall below its target. Okay, that's it. That's the model. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to analyze this model without the ZLB constraint, meaning it basically turns into an almost real model where R is always equal to R star. And I'm going to put back the ZLB constraint in and then see how that changes the dynamics of debt and deficits. Okay, so let's focus first on the case without the ZLB. And I'm going to begin by analyzing steady state equilibrium in this case. So what do I mean by a steady state equilibrium? I basically mean a level of government debt that can be sustained forever, where debt doesn't change. And for it to be sustainable forever, I'm going to have to pair it with a suitable deficit Z that is chosen so that debt neither goes up nor goes down. Now, how do I find that level of the primary deficit? Well, I have to figure out which primary deficit essentially sets that derivative of debt to 0 in the government's budget constraint. If I do that, I quickly find that the primary deficit that you can run forever without changing government debt for a given level of government debt, B, is exactly equal to the gap between the growth rate of the economy and the interest rate of the economy multiplied by the level of government debt. Now, what are these objects? Now, G outside the ZLB is always going to be equal to trend growth, precisely because inflation will always be at its target. So that's easy. G is equal to G star. R, however, is to be determined, and it will move with the level of government debt. And the reason it will move with the level of government debt is simply coming from the Euler equation. If you write down the Euler equation for our savers in the economy, it kind of starts out like a standard Euler equation, right? Consumption growth is equal to the detrended interest rate here, R minus G, minus the discount rate. But then there's this additional term which comes from the fact that savers derive utility from holding government bonds, and V prime is exactly the margin utility they get when buying an additional unit of government bonds. And so if you compute the, set C dot to 0 here to compute the steady state interest rate and solve for R, what you're getting is that R is a function of B precisely because now we have this convenience yield term in our expression for the interest rate. And that essentially captures that when there's more bond issuance by the government, the margin utility of holding an additional unit will fall for the saver, and so the convenience yield on the margin will fall and R will increase. Okay, so all this model is giving us is an increasing relationship between government bonds on the one hand and R star on the other hand. And that's going to be the crucial outcome of this model that will make it useful and interesting for us to study. Okay? Perfect. So I'm going to start drawing a few pictures now. And across all these pictures, debt will always be on the x-axis. And I'm going to start with a picture that just shows R and G, right? And as I just argued, without a ZLB, G will be just a constant. And R will be increasing precisely because with higher levels of government debt, the convenience yield associated with government debt will fall, and so the monetary return, R, will have to increase. Now, if the overall level of interest rate is sufficiently low, there will be an intersection here, where R exactly crosses the growth rate. And so the entire region to the left here is exactly the region where R is less than G. And if I compute now what the associated steady state, meaning indefinitely sustainable level of primary deficit is in this region, well, I have to compute, well, the gap between G and R times the level of debt. And if I make that computation, this is what it looks like. I'm going to call this the deficit debt locus. So what does that locus tell me? It's a collection of steady states of the model where if I put you at any point in this diagram, you're going to stay there forever. Okay? Notably, this implies that in this region here, where R is less than G, the economy can run a primary deficit forever. It never has to switch to a primary surplus. Okay? Now, this is just steady states. And you might be wondering, okay, well, what about dynamics? If you're talking about free lunch policies, that's all about dynamics and changing deficits. And that's what I want to talk about next and show you actually that this very framework, this very picture even, is very useful in understanding when a free lunch is available or not. So there's a very common view out there. And the common view goes about as follows. Imagine you have R less than G, and you look at the government budget constraint, right? That's literally just the standard government budget constraint where Z denotes the primary surplus and primary deficit, and B, the level of government debt. And so if you have R less than G, it kind of looks like, right, that this is a stable relationship, right? The coefficient of government debt on the right-hand side is negative. And so if I take this model, just this equation, and I increase primary deficits, the stability of this equation kind of suggests that all that will happen is that government debt will increase somewhat, but then it will converge to a new equilibrium level. And so this suggests that as soon as R is less than G, there might be a free lunch that is available. according to which I can just increase the deficit by a little bit without causing explosive debt levels in the economy. And what our framework suggests is that that conclusion is not correct. Okay, let me show you how. Basically, what our framework suggests is that it's really important to have that the interest rate depends on the debt level in this equation. Why? Because if you now want to evaluate stability and hence the availability of a free lunch policy, you can't just look at R minus G. You have to look at the entire derivative of the right-hand side. And you have to take into account that when you issue an additional unit of government debt, that will not just, be costless because that additional unit has a very low interest rate. That will also increase the borrowing cost on all the infra-marginal units that have already been issued in the past, precisely because their interest cost will go up with your additional unit of government debt. Okay? And so if I evaluate that derivative, I see that the correct condition for a free lunch policy is in fact not R less than G, but in fact R less than G minus phi, where phi is exactly the sensitivity of R minus G, and in this case, in fact, only R, because G is constant, to the debt level. So that exactly captures that effect on the borrowing cost on inframarginal units of government debt. And I'm going to show you later that these fees, once you estimate them in the data, are actually quite sizable and will materially shrink what we think of as the region where a free lunch is possible. Let me show you how we can think about the free lunch policies in our diagram here. So this was the steady state locus. Now imagine I start somewhere over on the left, right? Somewhere in this increasing part. And I undergo a policy where I start increasing deficits. I can put in these arrows and they will exactly tell me what happens when I, for example, increase the deficit to go up here. Well, I'm going to increase debt levels more and more and more until at some point I have to come back down to my steady state locus to hold government debt in check and not have it spiral to infinity. And at that point, I'm going to have to increase taxes, slash deficits, maybe even run a surplus afterwards. Vice versa, if I were to reduce deficits, right, I would go to the left and reduce debt levels. So what does a free lunch policy look like in this diagram? Well, a free lunch policy is one where I start on the left side of this curve in the increasing part, right? I increase deficits by some amount, but not too much, so that in the long run, I'm going to run into a new steady state without having to cut deficits at the end of the day, right? That's literally a free lunch policy right there. You increase deficits, you keep them high forever, and you don't have debt spiral out to infinity. Now, why is this a useful way of thinking about free lunch policies? Well, if you think about it in this way, it's very clear that there's never going to be a free lunch on the decreasing part of the locus, right? Because if I start over on the right side here, that was on the right side here, and I were to increase my deficit, there's no way I run into a new steady state to the right of it. And in fact, I will absolutely have to cut deficits to come back down to the steady state locus. And so what you see here, the right point at which the free lunch region ends is exactly this point up here where R is equal to G minus phi. It is not this point that is often emphasized where R is equal to G. In fact, there's absolutely no change in slopes here, right? So that point has nothing to do with the availability of a free lunch policy. The right point here to look at is exactly R equal to G minus phi. And this also implies, by the way, that if you think about present value budget constraints, that in this region, even if R is less than G here, which has been giving a lot of trouble to people trying to write down a present value budget constraint because you're trying to discount with R minus G, and that's a negative object, right? But if you do this over here on the decreasing part of the schedule, it turns out you can actually write down a well-defined present value budget constraint as long as you take the correct marginal rate of borrowing, which is R minus G plus V, which takes into account this effect of increasing the borrowing cost on all the inframarginal units. I'm going to skip the rest of the math. It's a little too heavy for an afternoon. So one question that we started with in this project was, well, if we have this framework for fiscal space, what does it depend on, right? Can we somehow, rationalize why we seem to be having so much more fiscal space now compared to, 40, 50 years ago? So here are two ways to think about this. Focus first on the right plot here. So in this plot, we're increasing inequality between savers and spenders in the economy. And so if you increase inequality, meaning you hand more resources to savers, naturally the demand for government debt will go up. And that will drive down interest rates and will actually make it easier for the government to finance larger deficits. So the free lunch region and this entire locus expand with greater inequality. So that could be one thing that was going on that helps rationalize why fiscal space seems to be much more ample now than previously. But one thing that this highlights is that there's a potential conflict that this poses between, on the one hand, trying to leverage that additional fiscal space for deficit finance programs, and on the other, trying to reduce inequality, which kind of reverses some of that resource shift from spenders to savers, right? Because you can't just, take away resources from savers and then expect them to still keep saving at the same rates in government debt and finance the deficits needed to run large deficit finance programs. On the left here, I'm feeding in what was already called today the prototypical demand shock in New Keynesian models, a discount rate shock. I'm increasing the discount rate here to make people more impatient and want to spend more. And it turns out that which we think of as kind of a good shock actually tightens the budget of the government, tightens fiscal space, reduces the locus here over on the. Great. So this was all fiscal space without the ZLB. Now let me add the ZLB and see what happens in this case. And the reason we wanted to do this is we wanted to think of one particular country that had seen a lot of time at the ZLB, which is Japan. Okay? So imagine now we're in a world where the natural rate is negative. So in this case, the economy will be at a zero lower bound, and the actual nominal rate will be stuck at zero. It can't fall as much as the natural rate falls. In this case, we're going to have that there is a positive output gap. Y will fall below potential, below 1. And then we have a system of equations that we need to solve for what now, in this case, inflation and output are. I'm going to spare you the details, but I'm going to give you the highlights. So what will happen in this case is that now the interest rate will be constant at 0, but instead the growth rate, the nominal growth rate, will now vary with the level of government debt. How so? The reason will be that with lower levels of government debt, R star, the natural interest rate, will fall more below 0 than before. And that will make the ZLB, so to speak, more binding. And so you see in this expression that pushes down the nominal growth rate because it pushes down inflation further below its target. Okay? So which is constant of the two and which varies with government bonds exactly flips at the ZLB. So if I show you the plot that I showed you before, again now with a ZLB region, you see exactly what's going on, right? We already know outside the ZLB, the nominal rate depends on the debt level. As lower and lower debt levels increase the convenience benefit. But once we hit 0 here, the nominal rate will get stuck at 0, and as we go to the left, we go further and further into the ZLB region. And as we go further into this region, the nominal growth rate will start falling because inflation will start falling more short of its target. And so this gap between G and R, which is important for how much of a deficit I can run, if you remember the formula for the deficit was exactly dependent on the gap between G and R, that kind of shrinks again as we go to the left. And so if I plot what fiscal space looks like here, I plot what kind of deficit you can run. In this world, you see that suddenly at the ZLB, there's less of a deficit that you can run, precisely because that gap between G and R now narrows as we go as we go to the left. Having said that, at a binding ZLB, we always are, in this case, in the free lunch region, meaning we're to the left of this peak. So you can see by increasing deficits here, you could make your way out of that ZLB. Now, there's one thing that can happen in this model that is actually super interesting, and I wish I had enough time to give you all the details. Let me just show you the plot and then try to give you an intuition of what's going on. So one thing that can happen here, if inflation is sufficiently responsive at the ZLB, it falls sufficiently at the ZLB, is that we can have a backward bending locus for the ZLB. Okay? So what is going on here? And in fact, this is what we're going to find is true for Japan. So let me explain what's going on here. Imagine you are at this point right here at the ZLB. You're not quite in the ZLB region yet. Okay? And in that region, imagine you reduce deficits. That will certainly reduce. But whenever inflation is below target, it gets sort of harder for government, it gets harder for government debt to sort of fall naturally as the economy grows, because now nominal GDP growth will slow down because inflation falls below target. So there's a natural force here that actually acts towards increasing government debt, precisely because inflation starts to slow down, starts to fall below target. And if that effect is sufficiently large, and if government debt is sufficiently large, that can actually overwhelm the direct effect from cutting deficits on government debt, and you actually get this backward bending locus here. Okay? Vice versa, if you're already in the ZLB region and you were to enact expansionary fiscal policy where you increase deficits, right? You'd think that that increases debt levels, but if it also increases inflation, that will counteract the increase in debt coming from higher deficits. And again, if that increase in inflation is sufficiently strong and multiplied by a sufficiently large level of debt, you can actually get that in total, you go to the left towards reduced debt levels. Great. So in my last few, do I still have some? 10 minutes. Okay. Ample of time here. So in my last 10 minutes, I want to quantify this framework for the US economy and for the Japanese economy. So the key determinant of this locus is coming from the shape of this convenience yield that crucially depends on the marginal convenience utility V prime of B here. And here we go with the literature in our main analysis, but we provide a robustness in our paper and assume that that is a linear function of government debt, where phi is exactly that sensitivity of R minus G to the debt level. Now, what is phi here? And this is where Annette's work comes in, and this is where Thomas Laubach's work comes in, because he, among other people, has estimated that kind of a phi parameter in the data. We provide an extensive survey in the paper, and we find that phi, broadly speaking, is in a range from between around 1.2% and 2.2%. And we pick the midpoint as our main baseline parameter choice, but we provide robustness also in the plots that I'm going to show you. So we're going to use 1.7% for phi. What does that mean? Let me put some intuition to this. This means that if I increase government debt by 1%, that the R minus G goes up by 1.7 basis points. So if you take the recent increase in government debt that we had in the US, let's say 10%, then that would mean that according to these estimates, R minus G goes up by 17 basis points. Okay, so that's going to be our benchmark case. You already see that this kind of a phi, that's in the same order of magnitude as the gap between G and R that we typically get from, say, Olivier Blanchard's work. So this is not just a minuscule correction. This is going to be a big tightening of the R less than G constraint that's going to come in by just accounting for that phi. We're going to calibrate the remaining parameters of our models to the pre-COVID steady states in Japan and the US. I say that because before COVID, it looked like they were pretty much at a steady state. And then obviously COVID upset that, and we can discuss what the effects of the COVID shock were on our diagram and on our analysis in the Q&A later. So this is what it looks like. On the left, we have the US. You see in solid our main baseline assumption coming from the fee of 1.7%. These dotted lines here are the two alternative cases for fee. And you see that according to this calibration, the US economy is in the free lunch region. It's to the left of the peak. It has R just below G minus phi. But it's really not far away from the peak itself. And so, so there's not that much space to run an increased deficit forever. There's not that much space for a free lunch fiscal policy here. Compare that to Japan here. Japan has, despite having huge government debt, it has very low interest rates and very low inflation. This kind of makes the model want an extreme amount of saving pressures coming from savers in the model. And so we find that despite the high level of government debt, we are in this backward bending part of the deficit debt locus. And so this implies for Japan, according to our model, that if it were to increase deficits, not only is debt not going to spiral out to infinity, it's in fact going to, over the long term, actually fall precisely because that additional stimulus, when deficits are increased, would add to inflation, and that would, all else equal, bring down government debt rather than increase it. Vice versa, if you try to be a fiscal hawk, in this framework at least, and you try to raise taxes on people, you would have the exact opposite effect from the typical intuition. Great. With that, I'm actually basically done already. I'm not going to take the remaining 5 minutes to just talk about these 4 bullets here, but let me just summarize the main insights that we got from this research. So we started with this standard textbook logic, according to which if you run higher deficits forever, you're going to get explosive debt trajectories, unless at some point you cut the deficit well below the original level. You kind of pay for the additional deficit. So we find that actually when R is less than G minus phi, not when R is less than G, that debt doesn't even have to be explosive. Could well be that increased deficits forever have a debt level that converges to some well-defined new steady state debt level. We find that when the ZLB is binding, increasing deficits may not even increase debt levels at all in the short run. In fact, debt levels might decrease. And finally, we found that inequality increases fiscal space outside the ZLB. And what I haven't told you, but we show in the paper in great detail, is that actually it tightens fiscal space at the ZLB precisely because it's going to reduce aggregate demand because more resources are now in the hands of savers rather than spenders. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ludwig.
So thank you so much for inviting me to this conference in honor of Thomas. It's a great pleasure to be here. I got to know Thomas not only for his outstanding academic contributions, but also because he used to travel to Basel to attend the BIS meetings on monetary policy. And he played also a very important role in helping the BIS initiate the discussions with, among central banks on monetary policy frameworks. He brought his clear thinking and his passion for monetary policy into those discussions, and he was a real driver of those meetings. And he also always was kind and humble, which really made it a pleasure to have him around. So I'm very glad to discuss this paper because also, among other things, builds on the estimates of R-star that Thomas provided quite some years ago. So the paper asks 2 main questions. And the first is whether deficits are always needed to be offset by future surpluses, or if there are cases when there is a free lunch available for the governments. And second, if there is a free lunch, then it asks whether this requires R to be less than G. And the main answers are that a free lunch requires R to be less than G minus 5, where this phi is the semi-elasticity of the convenience yields that government debt provides. And it's a more restrictive condition that R minus G. And also, it shows that a free lunch can arise also at the zero lower bound, but there the relationship between deficits and debt can be non-monotone. So in my discussion, I will first try to summarize the main mechanism at play in the model and provide some comments. But then, since this is an academic conference that is also in honor of Thomas, I will try to step back from the model and highlight what I think are the main challenges for central banks in the current circumstances coming from the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy. So there are, Ludwig did a great job in describing all the details of the model. I won't be able to do that, but just there are 4 key ingredients of the model that helps understand the mechanisms. The first is a Phillips curve that is characterized by the slope parameter kappa. The second is a standard Euler conditions that also reflected the benefits, the convenience benefits that government bonds bring to savers. The third is a definition of the semi-elasticity of the convenience yields that measure the increase in R minus G that comes from an additional issuance of a government bond. And the last important ingredient is the government flow budget constraint. And this is important because it already highlights 2 channels through which deficits affect the debt evolution. The first is a direct channel. It just says that if you have 1 more unit of Z, of the deficit, that will tend to increase the debt. But there is also an indirect effect to the extent that an additional unit of deficit help increase G minus R. This indirect effect could be large enough to compensate the direct effect, and it could lead to a reduction in debt. So the first thing that the paper does is to analyze the conditions for a free lunch away from the zero lower bound. And the question is, for each level of debt, what is the maximum deficit that is consistent with a debt that is not increasing? And so you can analyze that in steady state in a situation where monetary policy can perfectly implement the natural allocation. So this is a case where R will be equal to R star, and inflation will be at target, output will be at potential, and the nominal growth will be constant at the following the inflation rate, which is at target. And then you can use the Euler equation of savers and set consumption to a constant, as it will be in steady state, to realize that any movement in government debt will now affect the natural rate of interest, because all the rest in this condition are exogenous terms. And you can do the same with the flow government budget constraint. You set debt to a constant and check what locus for the deficit is consistent with that constant level of debt. And so combining these conditions, Ludwig told us how to get to this figure, which shows that the locus of deficits consistent with stable debt is shaped, and it peaks at a level of debt that is equal to this B star. And this B star arises where R is equal to G minus phi. So any level of debt below this B star will be in a region where R is less than G minus phi, and so this will be a region where a free lunch is possible. You can increase the deficit, and still that will be consistent with the stable, perhaps larger, but stable level of debt. Why is that? What is the intuition is that imagine you need to issue one additional unit of bonds. That will provide a cash flow to the government to the extent that R is less than G, so the government will gain G minus R, but at the same time, it will have to pay all the outstanding stock of debt, the interest on the outstanding stock of debt, and this interest will increase by phi, this elasticity. So you will have to compare the gain, which is G minus R, to the increase in what they will, the government will have to pay on the outstanding stock of debt, which is phi, and only when the benefits exceed the cost will be a region of free lunch, and that's at the left of B star. The second thing that the paper does is to characterize the free lunch at the zero lower bound. Here, the natural rate of interest turned negative. The policy rate cannot fall, it's stuck at zero, so it remains constant. And here, output is below potential, inflation is below target, and nominal growth will also be below the level, the exogenous level G star that would prevail away from the zero lower bound. And so, if you then substitute the output gap in the condition for the nominal growth rate G, you can see that there is a complex relationship between the level of debt and growth in the economy at the zero lower bound, and this relationship will depend critically on the slope of the Phillips curve. And this will lead to this locus for the sustainable level of a deficit. And if the Phillips curve is very flat, then you will be on this part of the, is it? I don't see the point. Here. You will be in this part here. And that's because an increase in deficit will help sustain aggregate demand at the zero lower bound and therefore inflation, but the effect on inflation will not be very large. And so the reduction in real debt will not really prevail over the direct increase in debt coming from an increase in deficit. And so you will be in a free lunch region, but still an increase in deficit will also lead to an increase in debt. Now, instead, if the slope of the Phillips curve is steep, is high, then you are on this branch of the curve. And here, the effect of increasing deficit on growth and therefore on inflation is so large that then the higher inflation can help reduce the real value of debt. And so the indirect effect of an increase in deficits on the debt will prevail over the direct effect. And you can have that an increase in deficit will actually lead to a decline in debt. So the third thing that the paper does is to assess empirically or quantitatively the space that is available in the US and Japan. So the paper calibrates the model, and then in addition also runs some panel regression to estimate the level of the semi-elasticity phi, and they come up with this point estimate 1.7, and then they do robustness. But what is important is that then they make an assumption of about a linearity of the function V prime, this convenience benefit function, such that the semi-elasticity is constant, so the same for any level of debt. And under this simplifying assumption, they can obtain a very simple expressions that allow to compute the maximum level of debt B star and of deficit Z star, depending only on initial conditions and trend growth. And so then you can, they computed this maximum level of sustainable deficit being 2% for the US, and an even much larger level of sustainable deficit for the Japan, despite the level of debt being much larger. And the reason for the difference is that the fact that Japan is much closer to the zero lower bound, so R minus G is large. So that's for the model. And now let me provide a few comments before I I move. So the first comment is that the focus of the paper is on steady states within that region of R minus G. And on nearby transition dynamics. Now, we know from previous literature that R minus G fluctuates quite remarkably and also can change sign, and that's what you can see in the left panel of this figure, where I plot R minus G for 17 advanced economies since 1950s. And of course, at the same time of variability, you can observe it also in R minus G plus phi, except that the phi really shifted the locus a bit upwards, and so makes the occurrence of negative values or the free lunch region less frequent historically. But the point here that I would like to raise is what role is there for time variation in these boundaries of the region and for the assessment of the region for the space for a free lunch. The second comment is about the exogeneity of phi. So I took the same data that the paper uses, and I did the same regression of R minus G on the log of government debt to GDP, but distinguishing countries with above or below median debt to GDP. And the regression results show clearly that there are significant differences across different specifications in the estimate of phi for countries with high and low debt to GDP levels, and the coefficients are much higher for countries with below median levels. And so this suggests that the homogeneity of phi could call for need for a different specification of the V prime function with the implications for the quantification of the region of free lunch. And the last point I would like to make is that the assessment, the quantitative assessment of this region of free lunch seems to me to entail quite a difficult judgment and may suggest a bit of caution in exploiting these free lunch regions by increasing deficits. And one example here, I was just trying to think, okay, now we are not pre-COVID, we're after COVID, so what has changed and how does that affect the maximum level of sustainable deficit? So here I reported the values for the US that you observed in December 2022 relative to the December 2019. And then I was a bit in trouble. What do I do with those? So B0 is the initial debt to GDP. That's higher, fine. So we can have a conservative scenario where you assume that B0 is permanently higher, but you keep the same assumption about R minus G. And that would not change much the level of maximum sustainable deficit, which is 2%. But if you think that the current level, a high level of interest rate will still not go back to pre-COVID level, and G minus R will be lower, say 1% instead of 2%, then the maximum deficit would be only half, around 1.1%. So let me move to the last part of my discussion, which is try to think a bit instead what are the current challenges for central banks arising from the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy. Clearly, the current high levels of public debts and deficits and weakening growth are also providing some challenge for fiscal space, but they're also providing difficulties not difficulties, but they're challenging also central banks in the sense that the high level of deficits and debt can work at cross purposes with the tightening of monetary policy, and may also delay the achievement of disinflation. And the second challenge I see is that high debt levels and spikes in interest rates may lead to sharp repricing and bring the economies closer to regions of financial instability, something that Ben Bernanke told us before during the panel. So I would like to expand a bit on this last point, the possible risk for financial stability. And I think that doing that with a simple three-period model that I've been working on with Paolo Cavallino and Frank Smets recently. It's a very simple framework. It is not a quantitative one, but just want to highlight channels. And this is a standard model in many respects, but what matters here is that there are banks that have a certain amount of net worth. They hold private debt, capital, and nominal public debt, BG, and they face an occasionally binding leverage constraint. And then there is a government that chooses the fiscal surplus and the central bank that sets the nominal interest rate. There are three periods in this model, a very simple model. T equals 0. This is the time of decisions. And decisions are based on the probability that a certain bad financial shock can occur at T equal 1. And at time 0, policy decisions are taken. The central bank sets the nominal interest rate, and the government sets the discretionary fiscal surplus. At T equal 1, instead, there is a negative financial shock that occurs with a certain probability P. And whether the leverage constraint binds or not will depend on the decisions taken at time 0. So it will depend on the level of capital, K0, on the government debt, BG0, and on net worth, N0. And at time 2, there is a return to the steady state. And so our exercise is to try to see what are the combinations of nominal interest rate and fiscal surplus that make the leverage constraint bind at T equal 1 if a negative financial shock occurs. And for us, the constraint becoming binding at T equal 1 coincides with the financial instability region. So this is what the model delivers. The white region is the region of financial stability, meaning that even if the negative financial shock occurs, the leverage constraint will remain slack in period T equal 1. But the blue regions are the financial instability ones where the constraint will turn binding. Now, at the left of this vertical black line, you have regions of the economy when the public debt dominates, so it's larger than private debt. And indeed, these are the regions where the primary surplus is negative. And on the right of the line, instead, you have regions of financial instability that arise where private debt dominates. So there is a large amount of private debt in the balance sheet of banks. So, so imagine that you are at the steady state, which is this tiny little point here. And you now start increasing. You are in a region where public debt is large on this side, and you start increasing interest rate. So this from steady state. And this can bring you to financial stability regions because increasing interest rates can increase the debt-to-service ratio. It reduces the asset price and therefore the value of net worth, and it also depresses real activity and inflation, therefore increasing the real value of the debt. Instead, if you are in the region where private debt dominates, the risk comes when you are reducing the interest rate because that's what increasing the demand for capital or for private debt, and also supports the real economy and the demand for credit. Now, of course, these regions move with the characteristics of the economy, but let me make my point with this figure here. This shows the regions that we saw before of financial instability, but it also shows the region of macroeconomic stability. So here, this is the steady state. It's within a region of macroeconomic stability, meaning that the inflation and output gaps are closed or close to 0. And this is the region between these red lines. Now imagine that there is a negative demand shock that shifts this region of macroeconomic stability to the left. Now, how can policy react? Of course, you can just react with monetary policy. You decrease the interest rate, and you move and you stabilize the economy. Or you can do it with fiscal policy. You just run deficits and bring back the economy to macroeconomic stability. But doing these unilateral moves in policies can also bring you closer to the regions of financial instability. And so measures that combine monetary and fiscal action can achieve the same macroeconomic stability, but reduce the probability of financial instability across the road. So that's my last slide and conclusions. Monetary and fiscal policies can contribute to macroeconomic stability and therefore to the fulfillment of the mandate of central banks. But the feedback between interest rates and debt can also be a risk for financial stability tomorrow and macroeconomic stability then the year after. And so keeping the economy within this financial stability region is an important task for central banks, but can also constrain their use of policy tools. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiorella.
Great. First of all, thank you very much, Fiorella, for working your way through a very dense paper. All the points you made are very well taken. I just wanted to say two things on two of the points you mentioned. The time variation, R, G, and phi is something that we've been thinking about as well. What do you do if you are in a stochastic world where all of these three objects move around? What's the right condition in that case? So we have a section where we exactly study that, where we allow for aggregate risk in the model, and we actually show that basically, as long as the environment is stationary, right, which is a big if, but if it is, then you really only need to average R, G, and phi, and then the same condition, just averaged, still tells you whether you can run a free lunch policy or not. But that requires stationarity, and there's some shocks like COVID, for sure, that do not look like they happen all the time. And so there, obviously, you have to, maybe resort to other kinds of analyses where you draw up different scenarios, maybe where you, analyze a good scenario, a bad scenario, like Fiorella did in one of her slides, to see where we are in the deficit debt diagram. The nonlinearity in the convenience yield, I think, is super interesting. We haven't really done very much on that at all, so it was great to see that Fiorella thought that was important and actually cut the data the way we hadn't done it yet. I think you want to be careful when you do this by basically distinguishing cross-country comparisons versus within-country comparisons. Like I can well see that for endogenous reasons, the countries that have more fiscal space and lower fees load up more on debt, like advanced economies, whereas economies that maybe have a convenience yield that's much more sensitive to the debt level do not load up on debt as much. So it's a bit difficult then to cut by debt itself. So we talked over lunch also whether there's a way to do this within country where you can sort of see how a country's debt goes up and see whether their fee goes up or goes down, so which way the nonlinearity goes. Great. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much for the discussion again.
Thank you.
Stephanie?
So very nice paper. Just to understand it, suppose I forget about the ZLB, I'm not interested in that.
Yeah.
I just think about an endowment economy and I make your B money. Are you showing me the seniorage Laffer curve?
No, great question. If I have the clicker, this is a fantastic question. So let me take just this diagram. So when you have B being just real money balances in a Sidrowski style model, then actually over here, if you were to increase deficits, it actually operates exactly in reverse. You would jump to the left, you would not find that there's no free lunch here. Why? What's going on there? Basically, what happens in the Straussky model is if you increase deficits, that makes, in some sense, debt less attractive. And so the price level, or money less attractive. And so the price level will jump up, and that will reduce real money balances. So you will move to the left. And so you can't use that model to analyze free lunch policies the way we do it here. And the reason is price flexibility, right? If you, but you need, so for you, what you were, my understanding was that you want to put real money balances in the utility function,
Exactly.
correct?
It's money.
Correct.
Because
But
you
there,
showed me that y is equal to 1 unless I'm at the zero lower bound.
Yes,
So I can go
yes.
to the endowment economy.
it's appendix C.
Yeah.
But basically what's going on is, let me just reiterate, what's going on in that model is that the level of debt, first, the level of debt corresponds to real money balances.
Exactly.
That's an object that will jump around,
Yeah.
right? Because the price level will jump around in that model.
But why does price stickiness matter for the steady state? That usually never matters unless.
No, but this is not about the state. The free lunch is about transitions, right?
Okay.
The free lunch is about transitions. I can't just use steady states.
No,
That's
before
why,
we go even to free lunch, because I'm going to also have a question about the word free lunch. So I think this looks to me like the seniorage-Laffer curve when you looked at the steady state, because then the normal rate of return on money is 0, inflation is positive, so the real rate 0 minus pi is, I can make the growth rate 0. So it's an exact match. So then we usually think about, when we are talking about a free lunch, what is your measure? I mean, people hate it here when you increase debt. I don't see how, with money in the utility function like you have it, why are people happy? Unless, of course, you're going to go to the zero lower bound.
Great.
But you're minimizing welfare or not? I mean,
No.
How come?
so many questions.
In the steady state, it's impossible that price stickiness
Let me
matters.
take the questions one by one, if I may. Okay. First, is in our model now, not the Sidrowski model, is running a free lunch a Pareto improvement? Absolutely yes. Okay. Why? Because the government gets more resources, right? And you increase debt. And people like to have the availability to save in more debt. Right? It enters the utility. You could say, oh, that seems like a chicken model, but I can write down the exact same, I get a very similar shape if I say have a Bewley economy where there's idiosyncratic risk and people need that to self-insure. So people, No, Z, the government spending, it will be 1 equals C plus X. I'm not touching government spending. I'm just changing the path of taxes here. So it's really, I'm holding, basically the way to think about it, Stephanie, is consumption here along this line is the same, but they get more debt to save in, which they like. So it is a Pareto improvement. Okay? The same way that in the Sidrowski model, now to move to the second question, is that as long as margin utility is positive over real money balances, they appreciate having more real money balances. Right? And that's kind of the same logic here. On the Sidrowski model, let me give me one more attempt, and then if that fails, I will explain it to you one-on-one afterwards, not to hold up the show too much. But basically, and we've literally done this analysis because we're wondering about that same question. Basically, what happens in the Sidrowski model is that the analog of what I call debt here is real money balances. That object will jump around. Okay? The reason it will jump around is because the price level will jump around, and whenever the government would like to finance a larger deficit, it will be that the price level will jump up, right? Kind of makes money less attractive in some sense. And what this gets reflected in this diagram, I agree the steady state locus is the same in the Sidrowski model, but the dynamics are totally different. If I were to increase deficits in the Sidrowski model, I will jump to the left because the denominator in real money balances, the price level will go up, right? That does not happen in our model because here debt is a state variable, right? It does not jump around. You can increase it if you want by increasing deficits or reduce it by reducing deficits, but it works the other way around. I hope that was somewhat more clear, but I'm very happy to go into all the details after the Q&A.
Great, thank you. We have 2 minutes. Anyone wants to ask a final question? If not, then yes, sorry.
Athanasi.
Thank you. I was hoping someone else would ask this, but since we only have a minute left, let me ask this. The question is about balance sheet policies. So when we're discussing fiscal monetary interactions, and given the experience we have seen in the last, 15 years now, I would have expected a significant role for the effect of central bank balance sheet policies on the cost of financing of government debt, and then interact that with a very nice analysis that you're presenting here. So as I look at the chair of the panel, for example, Min Wei and co-authors have done this wonderful work demonstrating how quantitatively significant the reduction in the term premium is from quantitative easing. And if nothing else is happening, that actually significantly improves the fiscal space of governments at the ZLB. So I was wondering if you could offer some insights about how we should think about this. It would be an extension, clearly, to what you have, and how you think about integrating the whole thing.
Great. Thanks very much for this question. This is one of the extensions that we had in the paper a while ago, and then to fit it into a format you can actually submit it, we had to cut that extension. But I'm happy that we were not the only ones who were interested in this question. So yeah, very much in the spirit of what you said, what we found in that extension is 2 things. The first one was that close to the ZLB, or in the ZLB region, this really helped because it obviously got short rates, the natural short rate, R star at the short end, to go up. And so potentially you can use that to escape the ZLB region. It also more generally, exactly as you said, it more generally helped bring down financing costs for the government, and so expanded fiscal space in sort of more on the left side here where interest rates are low. Surprisingly, what we found is that as aggregate debt levels increase, that we found that in at least the framework that we had written that captures, the extension that we written that captures this, that convenience benefits of short-term debt phase out more quickly as aggregate debt increases. And we actually found that having a lot of short-term liabilities, if you include the central bank, that's probably one legacy of quantitative easing, actually leads to reduced fiscal space over in this right region here, rather than increased fiscal space. So that's one of the conclusions that we found from this extension.
Great, thank you. Let's thank the presenter. I'll return the floor to Trevor to offer some concluding remarks.
Thank you, Min, Ludwig, and Fiorella. That was great, bringing our inaugural Thomas Laubach conference to a conclusion, a very interested and spirited conclusion, so thank you. I just have a couple of remarks to close this out for the day. I want to offer a special thanks to our speakers, President John Williams, Chair Jay Powell, and Ben Bernanke, all of our session chairs, presenters, and discussants. And of course, thanks to all of you for attending today, whether in person or online. You really have been the key to making this a success. I would like once again to thank my amazing team in monetary affairs and our terrific partners here at the Board of Governors for making this event happen. I especially want to acknowledge in the back corner here, Nelly Ramdas, Nicole Haroon, Robin Ross, and Doyen Ajifawuk. their tremendous drive and dedication to turning this idea into this conference has been absolutely astounding. So thank you for that. And I also want to thank David Lopez-Salido and Annette Vissing-Jorgensen, who were instrumental in putting together today's program. And most of all, I want to thank Tomas. As we have heard repeatedly throughout the day, he inspired so many of us and in so many ways, from his innovative research, his insatiable curiosity, his dedication to public service, his passion for monetary policy, and his endless empathy and kindness. Thank you all for helping us pay such a fitting tribute to Tomas's legacy. I know he would have loved to have been here. With that, I wish you all well, safe travels, be well, and I'll look forward to seeing you at the next Thomas Laubach Research Conference. Thank you.